Welcome. My name is Matt Wilson, and thank you for joining us for episode 50 of the Fire Dog Podcast. In this episode, Chris and I have the privilege of speaking with Chief Jason Hoevelmann, Fire Chief of Florissant Valley Fire Protection District in North St. Louis County. Chief Hoevelmann has 28 years of experience in the fire service. He's held various positions, including Company Officer, Battalion Chief, and now Fire Chief. He's the author of two books, No Exceptions Leadership, the Leadership Handbook, and The New Company Officer. He's also the creator of the New Company Officer Facebook page that some of you may be familiar with. The page has 40,000 followers. Most recently, he was the keynote speaker at FDIC, Fire Department Instructors Conference, where he addressed the critical need for change and adaptation in the fire service. In our conversation, Chief Hoevelmann shares his insights on leadership, discusses his books, explores the balance between higher education and fireground competency, and speaks about the importance of change and adaptation, among other important topics. It is my pleasure to welcome Chief Jason Hoevelmann. Well, again, Chief, thank you for joining us on the Fire Dog Podcast. We appreciate your time. I saw your FDIC keynote speech, and we thought it would be great to have you on to pick your brain about that and some other things. You know, I've listened to some podcasts you've been on recently, and I know that you have a book that you've authored that we'd love to just talk about just a little bit here. But and then anything else you'd want to talk about, of course. But before we get into any of that, I'd like to, if you could, just introduce yourself, let us know who you are and what department you serve in, and things like that.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on. It's a true privilege and honor to be here. Always like to talk about leadership and other things with people. And my name is Jason Hoevelmann. I'm the fire chief of a career department in North St. Louis County called Florissant Valley Fire Protection District. Just been the chief there for 6 years. Before that, I was a battalion chief for I think five, and then before that, a captain. But I've got 20, almost 29 years in as a career firefighter, and but I started in the mid '80s as a junior firefighter in a rural community where I grew up. Uh, at that time, it was all volunteer, one station, 175 square miles, and everything that comes with rural volunteer fire departments. And so I spent over 30 years with that organization as a volunteer and a fire marshal, and both of those of the experiences I've had have been amazing and really got me to where I am today, having the diversity of both of those experiences.
And you've got a quite the background in training and education, right? When it comes to a couple books that are out, social media pages, will you hit us with some of the stuff you got going on there?
Yeah, so 8 years ago, I sat down. I was recovering from prostate cancer surgery, and I was sitting at home, and I decided to just kind of put together the No Exceptions Leadership kind of handbook. And it's a book that just is a lot of anecdotal and experience-based quotes and phrases that are really short and simple to read. And it's not a book you read front to back in one setting, although people do it. It's more of a something you flip through, take notes into, but it helped me pass the time, and it was therapeutic for me as well when I did that. And um, some people like it, some people don't, and I learned a lot of lessons publishing that book. And then I wrote a book for fire engineering, which was the new company officer, and it's a real simple synopsis of what to expect and how to do some things when you're a new company officer. It's not a thick book. Again, I wrote it really to be a simple book and to be a starting point maybe for somebody who's aspiring to be a company officer, and some of the leadership challenges and approaches that you can take when you're starting to look at that role. And then I've got the new fire officer social media page on Facebook that blew up. It's got almost 40,000 followers. I think I started that, man, maybe 14 years ago. I'm not for sure. Early 2010s. And it was really out of frustration, dealing with, um, in what, in my opinion, was not the greatest leadership, and our organization was starting to turn the ship at that point to where we are today. But a lot of frustration and And so that's how that page started. And uh, people will tell you that a lot of the things I post are real things that have happened either to me or somebody I know. And then I try to put it in a small package that's palatable and easy to read and follow, and put it on that page. Got a LinkedIn and Twitter. I don't really do Twitter anymore, but I can't do anything in 144 characters, so I don't really get involved in that. But and then I've got I've been a fire instructor for almost 30 years. Started that journey in the early 90s. I've taught at the St. Louis County Fire Academy. I did teach a couple classes at East Central College early on, and now I'm a contract instructor for the National Fire Academy for a few courses. I've got firefighter. I've got, the fire officer one and two, an incident safety officer, those things. But I've got an MBA in public administration and a bachelor's in fire administration. And so I like to read. I like to read research papers and follow. I like to look for things that can be quantified. Anecdotal things are great. But as I teach and deliver coursework or presentations, really, I like to try to find not just my experiences, but things that are truly been researched and things that are kind of bedrocks of leadership and supervision and management, and that I can pass along. Now, people can do what they want with them, but I've enjoyed that.
Chief, I'd like to get into some of that research at some point, but you mentioned the Facebook page, and as you're talking about, I was thinking that it sounds like you're kind of the new era at the time, maybe when you created that, maybe the new era of chief fire officer or fire officer, where we're taking to social media, we're taking to some of these virtual conduits to, I don't know, to vent and to grow each other essentially. But I just found that interesting, kind of that. And I wonder your thoughts maybe on the advent of social media and how that's developed the fire service and us as leaders, and how that's maybe keeping people accountable too. I'm seeing it. I serve in the Air Force, and we have a popular page within the Air Force that's kind of I call it an accountability page, where people go on there and share their frustrations. And it's another real popular page, 40,000 plus followers, and it gets the attention of leaders in the Pentagon. Just wondering your thoughts on the value and maybe some of the bad things about doing something like that through social media.
Yeah, so I would say that my earlier posts probably had a little more edge to them than they do now. And I kind of learned early on the responsibility that comes with sharing opinions that people gravitate to and are going to take back and maybe use or practice. And so I changed some of that harder edge stuff pretty early on, because I do think there's a responsibility of any of us that are going to influence others in our profession or in life, that we're able to do so without demeaning us, without humiliating others, without it doesn't have to come at the price of someone else, right? There doesn't have to be a cost involved. And I think that's the dangerous side of some of these things. And I think the fire service in general, there are some pages that I have unfollowed just because they don't meet the same benchmarks that I have for decorum and etiquette.
Maybe a
And the
bit
one
too
thing,
toxic.
yeah, yeah, and I don't see a grander purpose in some of
Mm,
those posts and conversations.
mm.
Um, and so I prefer a constructive type conversation. I just read a really good book, and I posted about it last night. Leadership, leading through. I forget, I got it sitting over here, but it talks about how you lead through confrontation and crisis in different ways. And one of the big takeaways I've gotten, and I've seen other papers and articles about it, but creating dialogue as opposed to debate. Not that debate can't be useful, but for the most part, debate is a lot of what we see on social media. My opinion is right. No, my opinion is right. Well, here's why mine's right. No, here's why mine's right. And there's not a true dialogue. There's not a true opening of minds to say, okay, and inquisition. and questions that gets to the root of what we're trying to discuss. I go back to when the ISFSI and UL first started posting the studies they had on exterior water application, and how nasty those conversations got on social media, and how accusations flew about what the intent was. And I was on the committee of ISFSI at the time that helped develop a lot of that. And I will say that not everything that came out of that should have from the ISFI standpoint, but at any rate, today you look at it, everybody does exterior water. They did it before, they did it now, but some people wanted to put a spin on it that we were going to no longer go into fires, we were no longer going to do interior attack, we were putting life behind everything else, and none of those things were true. But it fit a narrative, and I think the fire service in general, I think we've gotten better at it since then. And I would argue that that was the catalyst for all of the UL studies and research that's happened since, that have validated different types of ventilation, that have ventilated. And so when you talk about social media, I don't post a lot on my personal page. I try to, whatever I put on my business page, which is the new fire officer, I want it to be constructive. And you'll never ever see me get in a debate with anybody on social media. With You're not going to win. You're just not going to win. And you have to. There has to be more meaningful, constructive dialogue about our differences, whether it's personal or in our profession, if we really want to solve problems and learn what each other's doing. And we all know, everything's local. Tactics are local, leadership's local because of the different personalities and characters. And so I think the people that do it well stay above that fray. And then the ones that want to make a name for themselves tend to uh, base themselves in those things. But
Yeah,
Yeah, to
it's
your point. Oh, sorry.
okay
Go
to
ahead.
be it's okay to be controversial, right?
sure,
In the name
sure,
of progress. It seems to be such a well, maybe an advent of social media, but obviously we see the same thing in politics where
right,
it's the extreme that sells, that gets
Hmm.
the clicks and the likes.
Hmm.
And so like so many people snap right to the extreme of, hey, this study's trying to take away aggressive interior firefighting,
right.
when obviously it's not.
Yeah, because you can't have a true dialogue on social media. You
Hmm.
just can't. It's impossible. You
Yeah,
know.
that was the point I was going to make. Yeah, it's a great space to share information,
Yeah.
maybe to air your grievances and share articles, share meaningful things, but not a great space to have dialogue.
No. No. And take those opinions that you don't believe, that you're not, don't match yours, and instead of getting in a argument online, go research the other point of view. Go do a little reading and see where they're coming from. You don't have to have the last word on social media.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about leadership more specifically. I'm curious on some of you'd mentioned that you gravitate towards researched things, researched topics. What within leadership, I guess, is researched, and is there data for, if I'm understanding that right?
So this is fairly new for me, and it started a little bit during my master's degree work. But my EFO, I finished the EFO, and it really pushed me to look for research that's been done. And leadership research has been going on since the 50s. And so, or maybe even before then. But um, it's just, as anything does, it evolves and it changes, and you have new perspectives. Interestingly, sorry, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Hmm.
Off the top of my head, I don't know how old that is, but that was leadership research. That was about self-awareness and understanding what people need. And so some of the research that I've done and read, I don't even want to say that I've researched so much as I've read research, are things about competency as it relates to perceived leadership. Okay, and there's a good paper on that. And then things like how does emotional intelligence uh, create different types of leaders? How do people that have more self-awareness and self-regulation, how are they perceived, and what typical leadership traits do they possess? And what types, and how are they looked at as from their teams and followers? What types of philosophies and actions are demonstrated with people who are bad leaders? There's a great book I just read called Bad Leadership, and it talks about demagogues and it talks about, narcissists and how those people can be good leaders, but their intentions are dangerous or damaging to their followers because they create bad followers. And so those are just some of the things that I'm interested in. That not all of it applies to what we do and how we do it, and not all of it is definitive. But that's the, I think, beauty, if you will, of research is that, you know, what I have found to be useful is the research is great, but I like to look at their sources because it gives you another insight maybe to a micro topic that's associated with that. And
Sure.
it just leads you to and you don't have to have a degree to do any of this. You don't have to go through a master's or a doctoral program. It's just how intimate do you want to get with the topic, and how well do you want to do it? And the other thing I've been looking at is how how much is predicated on a leader's ability to transfer knowledge, and what does that mean in the fire service? How does that work, and what is exactly what kind of person do you have to have? What level of competence? Um, do they respond or react more? And do they see the long term mission and vision of an organization? Because we're all temporary. And so, how effective are we at communicating and transferring needed and required knowledge for leadership development, officer development, in all those roles? I think those
You're
are
killing
very
it.
interesting topics.
Sure, building the bench or building your succession plan within the organization. Is that what you mean? As leaders,
Yeah,
how well
yeah,
are we in kind of creating our replacements, essentially?
right, right. And making sure that the knowledge is correct,
Sure.
right? Making sure that the knowledge isn't just institutional as it relates to our organization, but that we make pivots and shifts where it's needed to transfer correct and accurate knowledge.
When it comes to things in leadership that can be quantified, do you feel like a lot of that is rooted in like psychology and that kind
Y-
of research?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that you can truly quantify leadership just because some people will say that you've used quantitative methods for some of the research, but I'm not convinced yet that leadership is a quantifiable like it is with statistics or with certain numbers, right? So I think you can take long-term studies and like the book, The Leadership Challenge. I don't know if you've read that. That's probably as close as you're going to get to quantifiable leadership philosophy and research because it's been done over a 30-year period, right? So it's been an ongoing research, and so, um, but it's still subjective because everybody has different personalities and everybody has different needs and everybody has different situations where if you're a good leader, you're going to transform into what those circumstances dictate. And I think those kinds of things are hard to quantify. But yeah, there's a lot of psychology in these studies.
Yeah.
Well, to your
I'm
point, it's
sorry if
more of
I'm
an
getting
art
too
form.
academic here, but
Oh, it's fine. Absolutely good. That's great. Yeah, it's more of an art than a science, to your point, and so you can't quantify that. It's more qualitative, but it's a very interesting
I think if
topic, and it's
nothing else,
so
it,
important.
it should at least, if nothing else, it should lead you to ask questions about things that you go to find answers for, right?
Sure, absolutely. I'd like to talk a little bit about soft skills. You mentioned in the podcast you did with Make Do Suburban Fireman podcast, you talked about the importance of soft skills in the fire service. What soft skills, and I think you've mentioned a couple of, well, you talked about emotional intelligence, and I know that's a really important skill to have, but what soft skills are you referring to?
So I think that, a lot of the soft skills, that's not a term that it's been around a long time. In some places they don't like to use them, but to me it's the easiest way to define them is, it's the being able to deal with people. It's being able to put your own emotions and your own preferences aside to be able to really pay attention to what's going on in your environment, in your organization. So understanding that, an example I think would be is when I first made chief, I had a mentor of mine come into our department and do some development, and I was really proud to have him there, and I really wanted us to look good. So there was a selfish part of that was going on, a little immaturity as a fire chief. But we have a policy that when you have outside speakers, you don't text on your phone while they're in class, while you're in class. It's just common courtesy. And I was in the back of the class, and I was watching one of my captains text all morning, and it really made me mad. And I was disappointed. I was embarrassed. The presenter didn't care, of course, but um, I I felt like we weren't putting our best forward for this guy. And uh, but at the break, I went to his battalion chief because I knew that you have to set emotions aside and get all of the facts before you do anything. And so I just talked to the
Mhm.
battalion chief and I said, "Hey, did you see this captain of yours texting throughout the class?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you know, do you want to hand?" He goes, "I'll handle. He's my guy," which is what I expected. But then I said one thing that I had learned from that particular mentor and others that was there that day is that always be inquisitive,
Mm.
you know. And so I just told the battalion chief, I said, "Hey, before you do anything, ask him if everything's okay."
Mhm.
And at that time, this captain had been going through a really dirty, nasty divorce. And that particular day, he was supposed to be in court. And because our class was mandatory, he came to class. So the battalion chief's like, "Okay, listen, if you got to get on the phone, just leave the room. Next time, we would definitely let you go to your court case." And that was the end of it because we found out why. We found out what was happening. And so that's the awareness of what people are going through, the awareness of the situation that's predicated on being a good leader, of being um, people focused. That's one of those soft skills that comes with emotional intelligence, is being able to read the situation. You hear about, are they able to read the room? Well, are they able to read the situation? Are they aware of what's going on? Are they paying attention to some of those outside things? And so that's an example of soft skills. I think
Mm.
being able to not only have dialogue as a leader, but to create dialogue in tenseful moments. I don't know when this is going to air, but we're running a tax increase on Tuesday. And I mentioned I don't like to debate on social media. And we had a somewhat prominent individual in our community um, kind of coming out against it pretty strongly. And not all of the facts were accurate. And then it got some legs through some other people. And there was a social media site that was a lot of misinformation, and they didn't believe our numbers and all those things. And so since he was kind of the catalyst, I just picked up the phone and called him at home and just said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you about your questions. We want to make sure they're all answered and they're But I said, I don't want to do it on social media because we lose context." And he agreed. And actually, some of the things that he posted that he wanted records from, he had a typo. So instead of 24 years of data, he only wanted 4 years of data. And so we had a great 25-minute conversation, and then just a few days ago, he endorsed a tax increase. And so it's the ability to create a dialogue in a respectful and open-minded way. And credit goes to that individual too for being open-minded to hear my side
Sure.
and to participate in that dialogue. And I think a lot of that comes with the ability to put aside uh, the personal part of some of those things, taking some things personally, and you're always going to have feelings about stuff. But again, avoidance is a terrible thing. In the fire service, we're pretty good at it. And I think all of those things kind of come around to those soft skills of Number one, having the capacity and confidence to, but you have to be educated about the topics. You have to have competence to be able to do those things well. So those are just a couple examples, I think, of soft skills and how they're important.
And I think that's so valuable in the military. Obviously that's Matt and I's background, where so many things are very black and white.
Hmm.
Right? There's a policy against being on your phone, in the example you gave, and so as a leader, you totally could have gone after that guy, right, for breaking a
Yeah.
policy, but you would have been in a totally ineffective position as a
Hmm.
leader
Right.
if it didn't come to giving that person the benefit of the doubt, even though they were breaking a policy, and to lean into the kind of the gray area that is real leadership.
That's a
I think
tough
that's
transition for up and coming
yeah.
leaders, new company officers, or in the military sense, a new non-commissioned officer, is understanding that balance between enforcing rules and
Hmm.
treating people with empathy and being a human being. So you always have to. It's tough because I'm in charge. Listen to me. I have to enforce the rules, or I'm going to be criticized from my leadership or whatever the case. Yeah, you have to approach every situation with some level of empathy and treating people as a human being, and it just goes so far, and it solves I think much more than people realize when they first transition. And
Yeah, and I think it's important to differentiate that you don't let people get away with things. It's not that you're not
sure.
holding people accountable,
Hmm.
but I think it's important that if somebody does have a huge error, that even if just some type of discipline is necessary, I think as a leader or the supervisor, it's always better to start with a series of questions. Tell me what happened. Why did you make
Open-ended
that
questions.
decision?
Sure.
What were the conditions that pushed you into that? What were you had, tell me about what happened the day before or whatever. And then usually you can go, so what do you think we should do? What's and they normally tell you exactly what you're going to do to them, but now they've led you to that point and it's not as confrontational. It's not as they're like, yeah, I understand. I was a dummy or whatever. But when you just come in and hammer them, that's what they feel like, a nail. And so you have, you're still holding people accountable, but you're letting them at least talk about how they came to that decision. And then that's how you can prevent it from happening again. Hey, what would you do different? Next time call your supervisor, next time do that, and you can make that a learning moment at the same time.
Yeah, I think a
Yeah, I
doctoral
heard.
level leadership is like getting the person to come to the conclusion on their own.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that happens through that open dialogue, open-ended questions. Tell me what you're thinking.
Right.
Something as simple as that, and just kind of walking someone to the conclusion. Because it's easy for us to be direct, and it's really how do you say it's instinctive to be direct. But really, the
Yeah.
indirect approach is the most effective.
Yeah.
I feel like the key, and I heard multiple, and the last thing you said, Chief, is the open-ended question, right? The open
Yeah.
question of what do you think we should do, or what's the reason for this, anything
Yeah.
like that, and get somebody talking, because you may just have to fill in the gaps, right? They may cover 90% of what you're thinking as a leader, but when you tee it up for them and then you listen, I feel like that's the most effective way to get to where you need to go by, um, I don't know, I feel like that's got to be a hallmark of soft leadership skills is the open-ended question.
Yeah, and it takes a while to learn how to do that the right way and how to be comfortable doing it and how to disarm people in some cases without losing your cool and without, getting angry yourself. Because most of the time, people like that run into those kinds of problems, they know they screwed up. They know they're going to get in trouble, so they're very defensive. And you don't need to humiliate them or make them feel worse about what they did. You still have to be truthful and hey, here's what you did. Here's why you're here. Tell me what happened. And then when it's all said, well, what do you think I should do? Or do you know what comes next? Or, something like that. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to get a written reprimand or I'm going to get that. And yeah, you're right. And what'd you learn from this? Okay, we'll get this done. We'll put it behind us. It's over, you know? And, but it takes time to learn that, because it's like anything else. You have to practice it. And if you're not good at, um, if you avoid little problems as a firefighter with personnel or as a company officer with personnel, you're not going to develop those skills. And so when you can address the small things, and I tell people all the time when I'll do consulting and I'll work with other chiefs and with some people really struggle with this, these kinds of things. And I tell them, you know, there's an old Tom Petty quote from a song of his, and it's sure as night will follow day, the things I worry about never happen anyway. And um, you know, I was a little, when I picked up the phone to call that citizen at home to ask about their posts, um, there's always a little bit of fear of what you're going to run into. We had a town hall Tuesday night to let people come in, and it's rare that you get a room full of people supporting it. You get the people that don't support it, and it's important to be able to um, respect their opinions. And I tell people all the time, I'm not always here to gain your favor. I just don't want you to be an enemy. And so um, let's have a talk.
Yeah, that's a great
What would
quote.
you
Tom Petty
say?
quote. We suffer
So,
more in imagination than we do in reality. That's another way
Oh,
I've heard it.
100%. Yeah,
Sorry,
exactly.
sorry to interrupt you, Chris.
no, that's good. So let me ask you this: the kind of the whole leadership principle of what you allow is what you endorse.
Mhm.
It seems like there's a camp of people that would say, you've got to hold the line on most anything: the texting policy, the grooming standard, the SOP. What would you say to something like that when it comes to like how these soft skills are actually applied in practice?
Think there's a mistake. People make a mistake, and there's a misperception that to have corrective action has to be discipline, and it's the exact opposite. I can have, I can, I can tell somebody to turn their hat around when they're in the administration building and not write them up, and they still get the point. I can tell somebody, hey, you're not supposed to be texting right now, and not write them up. I can have those conversations as a leader, as an officer, so long as it doesn't become a habitual problem. Once it becomes habitual, then you do have to take. But for the most part, if you just, it's when you don't address it, when you see it, that it becomes a problem. To hold the standard doesn't require you to discipline everybody, because people have bad days. Some people just try to get away with what they can, and you have to hold them accountable by, you may just have to pull somebody in the office. But I'll tell you, I have seen bigger things come from something so small, because the small thing wasn't addressed when it was first noticed. And had it been just a comment or a conversation when it was first noticed, never would have turned in to what it was down the line. And no disciplinary action is needed. I had an acting captain when I was a battalion chief that our policy is you drain the pumps when it's certain temperatures and different things, and he forgot to do it. And got back and realized the caps were frozen on, and different things, and called me. He says, hey, we're thawing the truck out. We're out of service. And I'm like, well, did you drain the pumps and everything? No, no. I said, okay. So I went out and talked to him, and he was so remorseful and embarrassed and just beside himself that he allowed that to happen. That was worse than any disciplinary action I could have given him. So I didn't give him any disciplinary action. But the odds of him doing that again were so low, and he never did do it again. And so you have, again, it's that self-awareness of knowing who people are, and did you have an impact? He was more upset that he disappointed me and that he had to take his truck out of service. All those things meant something to him. He made a mistake, and that's what it was, and that's how we dealt with it.
Yeah, that's good. So let's kind of pivot to talk about education. Obviously, you're a
Mhm.
proponent of academics in the fire service. So we kind of talk to us about that, just your belief on higher education and its
Mhm.
application to our profession.
Yeah, I like education. I think it's very valuable. I think it's important. for our members to be as educated as possible. And I think that I think it makes an organization better the more educated they are. On the same token, and I'll go back that I also think that we're at a crossroads, um, and not necessarily at our own doing, but you there's a dichotomy out there of, well, you either have to be they want just experienced salty firefighters who are fire chiefs, or they're all paper chiefs, and I think there's valid points to both of those, but they're not absolute. So to, to me, the problem is that county commissions, city managers, the people that are hiring fire chiefs are not going to change or lower um, the requirements and qualifications they want for fire chiefs. So if we want experienced, salty fire chiefs, we need those operational all-stars to get education and be those chiefs. Because if they don't, we're going to keep getting the ones that just get the qualifications and education, but don't have the other institutional background that protects our members and has ability to advocate in certain areas that they just don't understand because they haven't experienced. And so I think that's a challenge that we have in the fire service. Um, the other side of that is that I do not believe that you have to have a certain level of education to perform a role. In our organization, there are no degree requirements right now for any position. Um, we have minimum qualifications for different things, but none of them require a degree. And I have mixed feelings about all of those things. But what I'll say is that um, I don't want to promote a person who is just focused on obtaining whatever the qualifications are. And then the rest of their career, they're tone deaf to the things around them. They don't grow. They haven't taken the education they've gotten and demonstrated and practiced the capacity to do those things. So then the education is meaningless, right? I'd rather have somebody that demonstrates all of those soft skills, who's respected by the members, who has shown the capacity to have those difficult conversations and handle crisis moments with measured and patient responses. And then I can get them education later that enhances those skills. And so um, I do think when you get to the fire chief level, if you don't have it, I do think it's important to get some financial accounting um, education, to get some, um, I think, conflict resolution training, get some public administrative training as it relates to human resources. And I think you have to have some aptitude for dealing with politics and understanding that language and the processes to protect your organization. So um, that's kind of my take on education. I like it. I enjoy it, but it doesn't mean that I think everybody should.
That's something I feel like the Air Force is actually a little bit ahead of the power curve
Yeah.
in where, every single rank in fire protection, there are firm certification requirements,
Hmm.
degree requirements later on as a senior NCO. And, you'll have people that say, to be in that position, you just want somebody that's been to, you know, the paper, cert mill
Sure.
of an institution. And ultimately, that's what the Air Force cares about, right? That you've got the paper to back that qualification. I care that you have both.
Right.
You've got the paper and the experience. But that's, I think, something that's kind of unique about Air Force firefighting is there's no appointment like, hey, you're the most competent firefighter in the fire department. We're going to appoint you to a company officer position. It is, as firm as anywhere when it comes to educational standards that you have to meet,
Yeah.
and hopefully you've got the operational background to back it up as well.
Yeah, the Air Force and the Department of Defense they put a lot of value in having a well-rounded individual. So they want the tactical practitioners, people that are good at the job operationally, and then they want smart human beings. That's who they.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, so they do a really good job on kind of forcing that upon us, and some people embrace it and some people don't.
Yeah.
But as an advocate toward the education, I'm an advocate toward education as well. And I've got, I've checked the boxes, I guess, but
Mhm.
I've gotten a lot of value out of checking those boxes too. But one, to your point about the requirements of fire chief, and those aren't going to change, and that you're going to need the degrees to get hired. But another point to that is that you need to be able to hold conversations with these city
Yes.
managers and mayors, and in our case, commanders, right? And they all have degrees. So you need to, I guess it puts a level of credibility to your name when you do, in
Yeah.
the eyes of the city manager and the mayors and the people that make big decisions politically that have impacts on your fire departments. And so it's important to have credibility, but also be able to keep up in conversations and understand, let's say, for example, the scientific process, or how policy is built,
Mhm.
how cities run. And it's great to be a firefighting practitioner, a good practitioner, a salty firefighter, but it's also important. There's a whole nother layer that impacts the fire service that doesn't have anything to do with firefighting. It's advocating on behalf of your department, getting the money that you need to be able to get the things that you need. And excuse me, degrees are, you know, uh, it seemed to me very important to that.
I agree. I think another component that I tell people is that when you become a fire chief or an executive staff chief of some sort, um, how are you going to be able to best protect your organization, not only from internal threats, but external threats? And what education do you need to be able to do that? And I would argue that formal education does play an enormous role in most cases in helping you do that. Because, like you said, you're going to have seat at tables that you didn't have before with stakeholders that are not familiar with what we do on an intimate level, that you're going to have to be able to communicate. And to communicate that, you're going to have to speak their language. And and to do that, sometimes you have to be aware of how are tax rates set, how are assessed values taxed, how does legislation get passed, and when you go to do you go to the state legislature to testify for or against bills in committee, and how that language has to be communicated. There's just so much that comes into that, and you have to be very adaptable to your outside contingencies and constituents. And I have found my education to be completely relevant and valuable with my MBA, and being able to understand how to read census data, and what that means, how to look at all of those things, and be able to plug it into strategic planning and predictors that could have impact our organization, both good and bad. And for those that have just been really high performing tacticians, that could be an area of struggle that can um, be detrimental to the organization and the members. And so I feel strongly about that as well.
It feels like people that oppose academics in the fire service, just like we talked about earlier, lean into the extremes, right? Where they
Yeah.
lean into, I don't care how many degrees you have, I need you to be able to run the fire ground, which that's important. Obviously, everybody should care about that. That's the most high stakes part of your job as a fire chief. It may also be, 5% of your job as a fire chief, where you've got to be competent in the other 95% that
Mhm.
is, largely administrative, where those academics and those soft skills are what you're doing day in and day out. So it's not I would say to those people, it's not an or conversation, right? It's not
Yeah.
either you're the salty firefighter or you're the academic. It should absolutely be an and conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. A good example
Have
of
both.
this that I like to mention is Adam Thiel, who was the chief and commissioner at Philadelphia, who came in there with a pretty good academic background, and originally really people weren't that excited about having him. But through data, through his ability to communicate, his ability to provide information to the right people, he ended up putting up more engine houses that had been browned out before, because what he found was the reporting was lacking, and he was able to fix some of those internal controls that related to more funding, more houses being put up. But it was largely in part because of his academic background and being able to look at information and data and then communicate it to the right people. Now he's a city manager there.
Wow. Chief, I'd like to transition a little bit to the change, adaptation, and action, the keynote speech that you gave at FDIC. I watched the video of it. I thought it was excellent. I'd like to pick your brain on that. Short of giving us a speech, of course, what are some, I'd hate to ask you to do that because I know it's 30 minutes long, but
Yeah.
short of doing that, what are some key points that you can give to our listeners on change, adaptation, action?
So I think when I look at the fire service in its entirety, and a lot of the things we've been talking about, some hot topic buttons like education, politics, different tactical approaches, different leadership approaches. I just think that sometimes, and we're not alone in this as an industry, but we're slow to react to things that make us uncomfortable. We're slow to adapt to things that are different. And I just feel like that when you look at prior examples, and I talk about um, the Officer Wilder in the Civil War, and they got the put the cavalry or the infantry on horses, and increase their weapons, and then they didn't win in Chickamauga, but it related later on into the war to success because it made the troops less tired, made them more agile, even though they weren't cavalrymen. And two generals voted against that change when he offered it up. But one general in particular said, "Yeah, let's try it," and it was successful. Then you look at Kodak, who really invented digital pictures, but refused to market it because they thought it was going to take away from their profits in traditional film. And then, they're not around anymore. So it's those kinds of things in the fire service that I fear that, we as an industry are not willing to look at what society is asking from us. When you talk to stakeholders and what their expectations are of us, a lot of times it's a little bit different than what we think their expectations are, but yet we still operate under our own assumptions as a profession. And I think it's short-sighted. There's still organizations that are adamantly against EMS. Um, if you have that opinion, that's okay. But I think, again, what does society want from us and what do they call us for the most? That's the indicator of what you're going to have to adapt to. I've got departments next to me that have failed to adapt to EMS. They've resisted it, and they're all failing because they're not they're not meeting society's needs in those organizations, and their tax rate is topped out. Their property valuations are low. That's a whole other discussion. When you start looking at school districts, you can start predicting the future from school district data. But so when we start looking at what we're doing, and we have triage cars, or we have community paramedicine, or we have for some places VES. There's chiefs that will not allow their people to VES because they don't have a hose line. That's just not reality anymore. No, really, no, it never has been. But we're so embedded in our own sphere and our own circle of influence that we're not willing to take risks, even calculated risks, to change for the better. And it's tactical, it's administratively, it's politically. Um, you know, just simple things that we just aren't willing to adapt to. I got asked on a podcast recently about my opinion on my members going outside for training, and I'm like, I wish I could make it mandatory, because if we only stay in our department, that's as good as we'll ever be. Whoever's in our department at that time, that's as good as any of us will ever be, and none of us are that good. We can always get more information, we can get more education, we can get more perspective, we can validate or change things from all of those outside people and classes and opportunities. And so, um, I just think that, especially from a fire chief's stance, is that I think chiefs need to take more risks that are calculated and that we can absorb the loss if it doesn't work out. But when we look at what we're investing in and how we're investing in it, whether it be looking at, like, I'm really interested in hiring a nurse practitioner at some point in the near future that would be the catalyst for a community paramedicine type of thing. But on the other end of that is that nurse practitioner would be our first contact for our members and families for minor medical needs that wouldn't go on our insurance. And therefore, our premiums will stay low, right? And so, and then I think about, okay, well, then I can open up a little center and I can charge neighboring departments a nominal fee for them to send their members to my nurse practitioner. And so we have to look at how we're sustainable, um, and operationally. How are we looking at apparatus? Our trucks just keep getting bigger, bigger, and bigger? Well, why? Are we pulling data down onto the types of calls we're running, and are we building our apparatus around the top 90% of those responses? Or are we just building what we like? I was in Wyoming a couple months ago, and Josh Waldo from the IAFC was there, and we were talking about the backlog of getting apparatus built. And he made a great point, and one I hadn't considered. Police, Ford, I think, builds the same police vehicles for everybody in the country. There's very little customization. They're the police package, and that's it, right? Now, granted, it's a vehicle, but what if the fire service said nationally, here's the fire package, here's 3 engines and 2 ladders, this is all it's going to get built? The backlogs would be gone because they wouldn't retool and have to change everything to customize the truck. And let's face it, 2 or 3 pieces of equipment would accommodate all of us. Just would. But we're so damn stubborn and we're so special that we'll never get that done. And so those are some of the things that I think that we're going to have to adapt to. The other thing is, how long can we impose property tax increases in our communities before enough's enough? And then when that happens, what do we do? I don't know, but those are the things that are going to have to start being considered, and we're going to have to adapt to those realities as we move forward.
Yeah, those are all great points, Chief, and it answers a lot of questions that we had. Moving forward, how do you balance the risk? I think that making informed, meaningful changes that account for risk. You kind of hit that, right? Like you find the balance between
Yeah,
not being too risky, um, you know, and you also mentioned kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, but keeping the community at the center of all decisions. It seems like the common
yeah,
theme throughout all of this. Like, what does the community need? What do they want? What do they need? Should be
yeah,
at the center of every single decision that we make. But in some cases, for good and bad, we're
hmm
stuck in tradition, I think. Which it's great that the fire service has such rich tradition, but it holds us back, I think, in certain ways. And your fire engine example is probably perfect. Everybody wants
yeah,
their specialized apparatus. And in some cases, it may be necessary. I'll use up here in the interior of Alaska, for example, where I'm at right now.
yeah.
They need engines that are well insulated so that they don't
Sure.
freeze up, right? So that's a
Yeah,
specific example, but you'd probably be hard pressed to find any more too many specific examples like that. So having options, fewer options would probably help us out. But
yeah,
And you're preaching to the choir big time when it comes to change and adapting. Air Force Fire Protection is undergoing this massive shift where for years in a deployed environment we plop down and set up what you would picture as a fire department, multiple stations, the whole administrative staff, the whole 9 yards there on location. And so trying to wrap our heads around what maneuver warfare looks like for firefighters
right.
and how do we adapt to firefighters being proficient in a dozen other things that our civil engineer commander, that's who an Air Force fire chief reports to, is a civil engineer who, to your point, does not necessarily speak fire protection.
Right.
understanding what their needs and for us are, and then figuring out how to accomplish it is something that we're actively working on as a career field. And so I'd love to know, you make it really clear that to be able to adapt and act, it's not something you just snap your fingers and do. It takes preparation
Mhm.
to be able to adapt and act. What does that look like?
I think it's a process. You have to create a system that allows you to look beyond what you're currently doing and what does the future look like. So when I did my EFO, 2 years in a row, I interviewed stakeholders from our fire district for two different topics, and I'll never forget the one lady was talking about our resources and different things, and she was very adamant that the fire department is almost always the first to see people at their very worst times, that they're overdosed, they are highly depressed and suicidal, they don't know what else to do or else they wouldn't have called you. Now we all know that we've got people that call and they're not in it, but she's not wrong. Her point was that because you see these people first and probably more frequently than the rest of society does, and the fire department, if you do research which is quantified, that we are always in the top three of the most trusted profession, not only in the US, but in the world. That's in the world. Um, and so, and the reasons why differ, but it's basically because we've built a reputation for the fire service that, despite some of our best efforts, uh, we haven't ruined. But I think what she said was that because of all of those things, you should be a conduit for people to get resources faster. You should have people who deal with addiction at your fingertips. You should have people that deal with depression and suicide and family disorders and family problems at your disposal. You should have people who, and the point she made was very valid and one I'd never considered before. We still haven't created a system for that yet, but that is high on our priority list. How do we build relationships outside of the norm of what we're used to that can better facilitate the needs of the people who we serve and interact with at the earliest stages of these problems? And what would be the impact of our community if somebody knew that the St. Louis Crisis Nursery was just 3 miles down the road and will watch your kids for 24 hours while you have to go to the doctor or have it or something of that nature? It was also an important that particular resource was important for us. We didn't realize it was there. And I'm part of Rotary. So one day in Rotary, this person from the St. Louis Crisis Nursery does a presentation. I'm like, heck, that's a valuable resource because now if my paramedics have an adult patient who's got minors that need to be taken care of but can't go to the ER, I can call St. Louis Crisis Nursery. They can take care of them without any angst or anxiety from the parent, knowing they're going to be fine. And so that's just an example of how we live in our own bubble. And those stakeholder interviews for me were magic almost about what they expect from us. It was interesting because in both sets of interviews, nobody really talked about how well we fight fire or how well we run ambulance calls. They want us to be productive members of the community. They want us present at everything. They want us transparent. They want us to provide information. They want us to solve community problems. Now, can we do that in its entirety? No, but it does change our trajectory and how we do our planning about what our service delivery is going to look like down the road.
Those are excellent points and something I'd never considered either. But we do
No.
get stuck in a bubble, particularly with it seems like maybe structural firefighting. Like we're in
Hmm.
our bubble and we focus a whole lot of energy, which it's important. But when you talk to the community, it's not the most important thing to them. Like, yeah, of course they want you to put their house fire out and save them, pull them out. but
Yeah.
they're more concerned that the likelihood of that happening, um, is lower in their mind than
Mhm.
them coming in contact with you during an emergency medical, you know, event or something like that. So those are
Yeah.
excellent points. And sounds like EFO was incredibly valuable to you in your department.
It was. I really enjoyed it. I really did, and I got a lot out of it.
Yeah, Chris had brought up change within the military. I think the military, and you brought up the example when you first started talking about it in your keynote speech about the Civil War and changing of tactics. And the military is such a great example of adapting to change. It's necessary for survival. And so I think
Right.
to be able to compete on a battlefield, like you're either going to die and lose, or you're going to adapt and change and potentially win. And so I think the military is a great organization to look to on what change looks like, or maybe how to approach it, or the historical examples and you know what we've done. But yeah, as you mentioned, we're in a transition period right now since about 2021 when we pulled out of Afghanistan and global war on terror came to an end. Now we're focusing our attention on a peer adversaries like China, and a near peer like Russia,
Hmm.
or some would argue a peer adversary like Russia. And so how do we compete? We've been fighting for the last 2 decades terrorists who don't have the technological advantages that we have. We're militarily incredibly superior to them, but now we are faced against an adversary that is equal, and some would argue maybe even superior to us. We won't have control of the air. And, we won't have air power, and that'd be the first time since World War II that was the case, right? So how do we compete in that kind of agile scheme of maneuver? So, but long story short, in the Fire Service and the Air Force and in the Marine Corps, what they're looking to do is really make us logistically agile. And so basically saying we're going to bring fewer firefighters, fewer resources, and we're going to be able to save human beings. Like our focus is to not necessarily save infrastructure or save aircraft, but to save human beings, because they're the most valuable resource, and we can put them into another aircraft. So that's kind of like the transition we're going through right now. But I just thought that was a great example to bring up, for our listeners, being that we're
Yeah.
a
For
military
sure.
focused podcast.
Yeah.
It's an
Absolutely.
interesting time, incredibly interesting time, and Chris and I are going through right now, and we'll see if we do ever engage in that adversary, which hopefully we don't. How it works out for us as in the
Right.
fire service.
In your when you the point you made about preparing to adapt and act like that, of getting outside of your career field or outside of your fire department. And I'm as guilty as anybody of, like, I'd rather just hang out with firemen all day. I don't necessarily want to go, you know, chit chat with somebody in the shop across from us. But if that's what we're going to be responsible for, repairing a runway, pallet buildup, any of those
Yeah.
things, to be effective, if you care about being effective, you've got to have relationships outside of your little bubble.
Well, and centering the
That's going to be
center again,
massive.
that your mission and vision on the effectiveness of the community, or the health and welfare of the community. Like, you are here to serve the
Hmm.
community, and so it not centering your mindset on just the fire service, but like to your point, Chris, like it's we are just a piece of the puzzle of this entire community. And now, yeah, we have to kind of transition our mindset in the Air Force to we're going to be responsible. That's another element, Chief, that I didn't mention, is that because of these agile logistics and bringing fewer people to the fight, we as firefighters and other people that are aircraft maintainers, for example, are going to be expected to do things that aren't within their
Right.
traditional wheelhouses. They're talking about, like Chris said, us participating as firefighters in repairing runways that are damaged, or moving aircraft, towing aircraft, or refueling aircraft, or loading munitions, marshaling aircraft, doing things that are non-traditional. So that's just the change we're going through.
Mm.
But that's all
Yeah.
centered around, though, that community mindset, so.
Yeah. I mean, being able to adapt to even little things, and an example that I've used is, you go back into the early 1800s in Austria, I think Vienna, and you had a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, probably heard of him, was trying to convince doctors in a maternity ward where the mortality rate was incredibly high to wash their hands. And they basically kicked him out of the hospital, called him all kinds of names, defamed him, ruined his career. And the doctor, because he basically was telling the doctors they were killing the pregnant women, because they would do autopsies and studies with cadavers and then go do surgery. And just something as simple as that was so hard to change because of ego and because of familiarity and belief. And I tell people, belief doesn't mean it's true. And you have to dive into some of those topics. And so, that's another example. It's a small thing. It's such a small thing, right?
Yeah, there's
But
other career fields that are they are caught up in their traditions as well. And
yeah,
is that from the book Outlive by Peter Attia? I don't know if you've read that one or listened to
uh,
it. He mentions that example in his book. He's a medical doctor, and he talks about what did he call it, like phase one, or anyways, he talks about how the evolution of the medical service, and he mentions that exact example that they were
yeah,
so reluctant to make that change, but it basically, just that focus of washing your hands and antiseptic surgeries and things of that nature
yeah.
extended our average lifespan by like 20 years, right?
It's
But and
insane what it did. Yeah,
it's incredible. And but he's now talking about, how do we transition into the next level of medical care? He's talking about being proactive versus reactive, because you go to the doctor when you're sick or you have an ailment, right? You go, and he's talking about how do we transition and teach people to be proactive about things in their lifestyles. Like, how do we do that? How do we teach them and educate them so that, because that's like the next level in his opinion. But anyways, just another great example of change and how powerful it can be
Y-
and
yeah.
how
Having the
tough it can be.
ability to be objective about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and to admit mistakes. And I don't. Have you read the book "The Fearless Organization" by Amy Edmondson?
No, sir, I have
So
not.
it's a great book, and she gives an example. Basically, how the book came to be was she was a researcher, um, and they were doing research on mistakes in medical practice. And basically, and I'm probably going to mess up some of the details, but what she found, what they expected to see, was that high performing teams, medical teams, would have fewer mistakes reported. And what they found was the higher performing medical teams reported more mistakes. The lower ones performing teams did not report mistakes. It wasn't because they didn't make them. It was because they didn't report them. And that was why they were low performing, because they weren't willing to change and admit those mistakes. Whereas the high performing teams were trusting each other. They understood the mission. They understood what importance the critique was and how to make better decisions. And so they were higher performing, but they also reported more mistakes. And it was an interesting. She goes into more detail, but it goes back to the willingness to adapt and change, and to be honest and have that self-awareness of, hey, this didn't go well, so how do we fix it? Right? That open dialogue.
That's a good connecting point to what we were talking about earlier with leadership and having those soft skills and creating a
Yeah,
culture and an environment where people feel comfortable to admit those kind of things. So I think that that's
yeah,
a
it's a
good
great book.
catalyst to, or good leadership is a catalyst to enabling change and adaptation.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I guess to kind of wrap this up, where can our listeners find your books and your resources on social media?
So both books are on Amazon, The New Company Officer and No Exceptions Leadership. I have no control over the pricing of the fire engineering book. So it's wildly expensive, and I have no control over that. All right. But those are both on Amazon. You can find me on Facebook, just under my name, Jason Hoevelmann. My business page or leadership page is the new fire officer. Um, and I'm on LinkedIn under my name. Again, I don't really do X or Threads. I dabble a little bit on Instagram, but not a lot. And um, I think if you just Google my name, you'll probably find my email and different things because I've written a lot of articles for fire engineering and other things of that nature. But my if you want to email me, it's very simple. It's my first initial and my last name, Hoevelmann at gmail.com.
Chief, thank you so much for your time this morning. It was great. We had talked about some great topics. Um, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up? And I wanted to ask if you had any guest suggestions or anybody worth interviewing on this podcast. And if not, that's okay.
So, have you heard of Chris Bloom?
Chris Bloom. Chris, I haven't
He's
heard
a
of Chris.
chief. He's a fire chief in Meridian, Idaho.
Okay.
There's another guy that I don't know well. We just kind of introduced ourselves to each other, and he's a retired lieutenant colonel
Oh, interesting.
named Oakland McCulloch,
Okay.
and he's easy to find on LinkedIn. And I can send you his information if you want it. But
Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
he literally reached out to me, kind of cold called me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I'd like to have a discussion with you." And we got on a Zoom call and talked for like 45 minutes and had a really great discussion about leadership. And he does a lot of keynoting. He's got a book, but I think he'd be interested. Chris is kind of an emerging fire service leader who I've been trying to do more with and collaborate with because we have like-minded ideas. He's actually a lot smarter than me, and so I've really reached out to him a lot. So, um, but I think those are two. Those would be two guests off the top of my head that I think would be worthy and would be good interviews.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chief. We appreciate your time.
No, my pleasure's all been mine. I love having these discussions, and I love the questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a good one, sir.
All right, you guys too. Take care. Be
All
careful.
right.
Thanks, Chief.
Bye bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fire Dog Podcast. You can find more episodes like this on our website, firedog.us, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also active on social media. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at the Fire Dog Podcast. That is the Fire DAWG Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and follow to stay updated on every new episode. We'd appreciate it if you could share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, either on social media or right there within your firehouse. This is Matt Wilson and Chris Boykley with guest Jason Hoevelmann. Until next time, stay safe.